Hey everyone, Effie here. Today I'm going to make this card using our new Cardinal Friends and Coming Up Poinsettias stamp set. So I'm going to start off by white heat embossing our Coming Up Poinsettias cluster onto some watercolor paper. And I'm going to stamp this twice onto my panel, and then after I hit the whole panel with my heat tool, melting all that beautiful white embossing powder, I'm going to do some watercoloring using Ken Oliver color bursts. The colors I'll be using today are alizarin crimson and lime green. So I'll be doing some wet and wet watercoloring, and I'm kind of going for an abstract, loose watercolored look for this background. I start off by wetting the poinsettia petal areas first with clean water, and then I drop in a little bit of alizarin crimson color burst into the inner portions of the petal. And then I take a second clean brush and I pull that color out just a little bit. And I'm creating a light wash of color over the petals. I want to make sure that the color is blended, but at the same time, I want there to be a little bit of definition among the images. And to do that, after I create that first wash of color, I go back in and I drop in more color bursts in certain areas. So you have different concentrations of the red color. So it's not just all one shade or a clean blend. You have a little bit of definition and interest going on with the light areas next to the dark areas. And this is the look that I'm going for. It's not perfect, but that's okay because this is just my background piece, and I'll be placing other die cut images over the background. I applied the same loose watercoloring to the stems and leaves of my poinsettia clusters, and again I'm using lime green color bursts. And at this point, some of the poinsettia petals are still a little wet, so when I put down some of that green watercolor, it might blend into some of the petals, and again, that is okay. It actually looks very artsy this way, but you don't want the red and green to blend too much because otherwise you get a brown, and I don't want a muddy background. So the a little bit of green can go into the petals, and a little bit of the red, the alizarin crimson, can go into the leaves and the stems. Like that is okay. We're going for a nice artsy look. So after I finish painting that first cluster, I'm going to go ahead and apply the same painting technique to the second cluster. For my painting today, I'm using Canson XL 140-pound watercolor paper, and then for my water brushes, I'm using Pentel Aqua brushes in a fine tip and medium tip brush. I like to switch off between brushes because I like to use the fine tip brush to apply the pigment to my images. When I'm working with smaller images, our poinsettia cluster is not necessarily small, but the images within the cluster are not large. As you can see, the petals and the leaves, they're small to medium size. They're not large. So that's why I'm using the fine tip and the medium tip brush, because if you use a large tip brush, it's just gonna spread the pigment everywhere. So I usually use a large tip brush when I want to blend into large areas, or if I'm applying the clean water to a large area on my panel. So that's when I use a large tip. But for smaller images, I'm sticking with the smaller brush tips. Once I finished coloring or watercoloring my poinsettias, I decided I wanted a little bit more to my background. So in our Cardinal Friends stamp set, you have a few adorable cardinal images, but you also have this holly or leaf branch cluster image stamp. So I took that and I kind of filled in the empty areas of my background panel, and I just white heat embossed the image, same as I did the poinsettias. And I just use the same color palette for the foliage clusters. I love how this abstract background came together, and I love how I really matched up that Cardinal Friends foliage cluster with the poinsettias. And because I use the same painting technique for all the images, it just created a really nice seamless background pattern. I love applying this loose watercoloring technique to white heat embossed images. It just really lends itself well to this technique. When you're working with smaller images and you're coloring them in, it's harder to stay within the lines because the images are small. So this loose watercoloring technique is perfect for those kinds of images. It's just easy and effortless, carefree. You don't really think about it too much. All you need to do is blend the color out just a tiny bit so that it kind of fades away into the background and you have this beautiful abstract pattern that you can work with for your projects. And again, with this technique, you can kind of mix and match some of your foliage and floral stamps in your collection. Even if they don't match perfectly, you can still get a nice cohesive look by applying this technique. Once my panel was complete, I set it aside to dry, and then I stamped this adorable cardinal image from our Cardinal Friends set in our Caviar Hybrid ink. One tip about this ink is after you stamp something with it, it is ink, so you want to give it sufficient time to dry on your paper. And if you don't have time, you can just use your heat gun and heat set the ink so that it dries completely. And once you do that, it is ready for coloring with your alcohol ink markers. And that is what I'll be doing with my cardinals. And I will be stamping additional branch clusters to go with the cardinal. But first, I'm going to color in this cardinal with several shades of red Copic markers. Now, I started off by coloring this by going from the darkest shade to the lightest shade, but um, I'm not I'm not an expert at Copic coloring, so I wanted to try coloring this way, but I think the best way would be to go from lightest to darkest, at least for me. I've seen other people color from darkest to lightest, and the results for them came out really, really great, and that's why I wanted to try it, but I just found that after I colored in that Currant shade, the darkest red shade, I went over it with the lipstick red, and then I ended up going in and adding more of the Currant later. After I finished coloring in the cardinal, I stamped the foliage cluster a couple of times in the same Caviar hybrid ink and I colored it in with my Copics. And then once everything was colored, I die cut everything using their coordinating dies. And I also took the largest die from our double stitch rectangles large die collection and I die cut my background watercolor paper into an A2 size panel. This die also adds stitching to the edges of whatever you're cutting into. So once my panel was created, I started assembling my card. I started applying 1/4 inch foam squares behind my foliage clusters, and for the smaller leafy areas, all I did was cut my foam squares in half and I applied them. I let that first cluster hang off my panel just a tiny bit, and I'll just snip off the excess later. For the second cluster, there was a little bit of space between the two branches, but that's okay because my cardinal's tail will cover that little space so that the scene will look seamless. Once I finished applying or mounting my clusters, I adhered that watercolored panel onto a top folding A2 size card base. I think I should have mounted the panel onto the base before I put the clusters because the watercolor paper was warped just a little bit from all of that painting and all of that water. But I just used some of our double-sided adhesive paper, which I cut into strips to mount the paper to the base. So that took care of the warping. After I popped up my sentiment, my card is now complete. Thanks so much for stopping by. I'll see you next time.